It began with a weapon so powerful, it devoured its own vessel. A British tank armed with the largest gun in history, a gun from which it would literally tear itself apart. But the story of that monstrous cannon begins not in a workshop, but on a scarred avenue in a conquered city. The 7th of September, 1945. Through the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin, a parade of victors. The four great powers assembled for a joint demonstration of might to mark the end of the most savage war in human history. Each nation brought the very best of its arsenal. The British rolled out their nimble Comets and the brand new Centurions. The Americans showcased their Shermans and formidable Pershings. The French, they displayed what little had survived the years of occupation. Then, a new sound rumbled across the cobblestones. As the machines of the Soviet Union emerged, the jaws of Western military observers fell slack. Before them was something they had not known existed, something they had never even conceived of. The IS-3 heavy tank. It looked as if it had arrived from the future. Its flattened, almost alien turret, with its impossible armor angles, seemed otherworldly against the boxy silhouettes of the Western machines. The front of its hull was forged into a pike nose, a design that made its frontal profile almost entirely invulnerable to any shell of the era. 120 millimeters of steel, sloped at a radical 55 degrees, yielded an effective protection of nearly 200 millimeters. The turret, in its thickest sections, reached a staggering 240 millimeters. And this beast carried a 122 millimeter cannon, a weapon capable of reducing any Allied tank to a column of fire and scrap from 2 kilometers away. The British officers present sent dispatches to London immediately. The contents of their reports were beyond alarming. Their finest tank, the Centurion, possessed just 180 millimeters of frontal armor. Its 77 millimeter gun, though considered excellent, now seemed a child's toy against such a monster. The Comet was even worse, with a mere 100 millimeters of protection, less than the old wartime Churchill. The military leadership of Great Britain awoke to a simple, terrifying truth. If the Soviets decided to push west, there was simply nothing in their arsenal to stop them. But the true horror dawned when they considered the future. If the Soviet Union had created this by the war's end, what would they build in 5 years, at work on something even more formidable? The Cold War was just beginning, and Britain found itself in a position where its entire armored corps could be rendered useless overnight. In the War Office, frantic meetings commenced, all centered on a single, desperate question. How do we kill the new Soviet heavy tanks? Existing guns were obsolete. The answer, they believed, lay not in better armor, but in overwhelming firepower. A pursuit of force so extreme it would lead them to create a weapon that bordered on the suicidal. A gun born from the fear that first took root on a parade ground in Berlin. The shadows of the last Great War had barely receded when new, more terrifying specters began to gather on the horizon. In the West, military planners watched with growing dread as Soviet industry, hardened by conflict, churned out a new generation of steel behemoths. Their thick, sloped armor seemed impervious, a rolling iron tide that could, at any moment, pour across the plains of Europe. To develop a counter was a process that took years of painstaking research and development. The British War Office required something radical, something so utterly overwhelming that no known armor, present or future, could possibly withstand it. And so, in August of 1950, a technical requirement was issued, a document that must have made engineers question the very laws of physics. The demand was for a weapon capable of punching through 152 millimeters of steel, angled at a severe 60 degrees from a distance of nearly 2 kilometers. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, in the British arsenal that could even approach such a feat. The initial calculations revealed a terrifying truth. To meet this challenge, they would need to create something without precedent. The caliber of this theoretical gun would have to be 183 millimeters, a bore diameter that exceeded the main armament of some naval warships. It was a vision of madness, but a madness born of necessity, dictated by a profound fear of Soviet armored might. From this crucible of Cold War anxiety, a machine would be conceived that would enter history as the most extreme answer to a tank threat ever devised. A weapon system built around the largest, most powerful tank gun the world had ever seen. The engineers at the Royal Ordnance factories were handed a task that would make any sane designer's hair stand on end. They were to create this titan of a cannon, and then, somehow, mount it on a mobile chassis. The calculations were clear. To guarantee the destruction of prospective Soviet heavy tanks, they needed a gun of at least 180 millimeters, firing a very specific type of ammunition. These were not conventional armor-piercing rounds. The British called them HESH, high-explosive squash head. Their principle of operation was devilishly effective. Upon impact, the plastic explosive would flatten a gay shock wave through the steel. It didn't need to penetrate. Instead, it would cause a scab of metal on the interior of the armor, a deadly spray of spall, to break off at hypersonic speed, eviscerating the crew and equipment within. By December of 1952, the weapon had taken its final form, receiving the official designation L4. Its true caliber was 183 millimeters, and with it, it shattered every conceivable record for tank armament. The barrel alone stretched for over 7 meters, longer than many city buses. The gun itself, without the turret or any associated mechanisms, weighed a staggering 2.8 tons. This created an entirely new class of engineering problems, challenges of balance and recoil that British designers had never before encountered. But the true nightmare for the developers was the ammunition. A single projectile for the L4 cannon weighed between 65 and 72 kilograms, roughly the equivalent of a washing machine or a fully grown man. A complete two-part round, projectile and propellant charge, stood nearly 1.5 meters tall. Loading it was not a task. It was a Herculean feat of raw strength and endurance. This was not just a weapon. It was a monument to the brutal logic of the arms race, a steel testament to the extremes one nation would contemplate to hold back the tide of another. It was a gun so powerful, it threatened to tear apart the very vehicle designed to carry it. A solution so absolute, it bordered on the unusable. The anatomy of a Titan's punch began not with a bang, but with the grueling, methodical labor of men. First, the loader had to heave the monolithic shell itself into the breech. Then, with equal effort, he had to ram home a separate brass casing, a charge containing 31 kilograms of raw propellant. It was immediately obvious that for one man to perform this task under the stress of combat was simply beyond the limits of human endurance. The sheer physics of the act demanded a new approach. With the weapon's immense power established, a far more complex question hung heavy in the halls of the War Office. What kind of beast could possibly carry this monster into battle? 4 distinct concepts were laid upon the table, each a different philosophy of war. The first was the most ambitious, a genuine heavy tank, crowned with a fully 360-degree rotating turret and wrapped in thick, impregnable armor. The second option was more focused, a self-propelled gun with a limited firing arc, but a massively reinforced frontal plate designed to absorb punishment as it advanced. The third path suggested a compromise, a turret with full or partial rotation, but at the cost of its armor, sacrificing protection for flexibility. And the fourth, the most radical of all, proposed stripping away any pretense of defense. It was to be a pure weapon platform, a gun with tracks and little else, its survival depending entirely on killing the enemy before it could ever be seen. The choice fell upon the second option, a pragmatic balance of overwhelming firepower and survivability. In January of 1951, design work officially commenced. The new machine was to be built upon the promising chassis of the FV-214 heavy tank, the vehicle that would later earn the formidable name Conqueror. This new project, designated FV-215, was slated to become the definitive carrier for the gargantuan 183mm gun. But almost immediately, a serious snag emerged. The Conqueror itself was still a phantom, a collection of blueprints and engineering challenges yet to be overcome. To design an entirely new vehicle on the foundation of a non-existent chassis was a gamble of monumental proportions. British military planners, ever the pragmatists, made a crucial decision. They would create a temporary solution, an interim vehicle to test and refine the weapon system using a chassis that was already proven and in service. Their choice was the Centurion Mark III, a reliable and battle-tested platform. This stopgap machine received the designation FV-4005, and it was this vehicle, born of necessity, that was fated to carry the largest direct-fire tank gun in history. Initially, the FV-4005 was intended as nothing more than a test bed, a mobile laboratory upon which all the violent eccentricities of the new cannon could be worked out before its final installation on the FV-215. The engineers understood that mounting such an ordnance on a medium tank chassis would demand severe compromises. The recoil was so cataclysmic that the turret's horizontal traverse had to be restricted to just 45 degrees to either side of the vehicle's centerline. The ammunition capacity was slashed to a meager 12 shots for the enclosed turret version, because there was simply no more room inside. The crew would consist of 5 men, a commander, a gunner, a driver, and 2 loaders. For no single soldier, no matter how strong, could wrestle the 70-kilogram projectiles alone. Work on the FV-4005 exploded along 2 parallel tracks. Engineers prepared 2 distinct prototypes, each embodying a fundamentally different approach to crew protection and the loading mechanism. Soon, both machines would face trial by fire, a contest to determine which concept was truly viable. The first prototype, officially named the Heavy Anti-Tank Self-Propelled Gun, FV-4005, was a machine that looked frightening even to its own creators. It was a product of the project's first stage, a raw and brutalist interpretation of the brief. On this initial iteration, British engineers had consciously and chillingly abandoned any notion of meaningful crew protection. It was a weapon, distilled to its most terrifying and elemental form. In the cold calculus of post-war arms development, there are moments when all other considerations, crew safety, practicality, even logic itself, are sacrificed at the altar of a single, overwhelming capability. In this case, that capability was firepower, and its altar was forged from the chassis of a Centurion tank. The designers made a stark choice, abandoning any semblance of crew protection in favor of the utmost structural simplicity. The 183mm L4 cannon jutted from an O in the open air, utterly exposed, without the slightest hint of cover from shrapnel or bullets. The gun's elevation was limited to a scant 15 degrees, and its depression to just 7 degrees below the horizontal. These were not errors in calculation by the engineers, but a concession to a terrifying reality: the recoil of this monster. They genuinely believed that firing with the turret traversed too far to one side would unleash a wave of kinetic energy sufficient to simply flip the 50-ton machine onto its side. No one knew for certain what would happen the first time this cannon roared to life on a tracked chassis, and the designers prepared for the most unpredictable consequences. On the first prototype, designated the FV4005, they installed a unique assisted loading system, a mechanism never before attempted on an armored vehicle. It was a massive revolving drum containing 5 ready-to-fire shells. The principle was startlingly similar to the cylinder of a colossal revolver. This mechanism was intended to help the loader manage the impossibly heavy ammunition, rotating the next round into position behind the breech and easing the immense effort of ramming it home. In theory, it was an elegant solution. In practice, it was a far more complicated affair. To tame the cannon's brutal kick, the barrel was sheathed in a concentric recoil system, a massive cylinder enveloping its lower half. This assembly was designed to absorb the weapon's ferocious energy upon firing, preventing the very structure of the vehicle from tearing itself apart. By April of 1952, the first prototype was fully assembled and ready for its trials. But before rolling it onto the firing range, its creators decided to take one final, almost archaic precaution. Bolted to the rear of the hull was a special ground anchor, a massive steel spade which, before firing, would be lowered to dig deep into the earth. This anchor was meant to hold the FV4005 in place, to prevent the multi-ton machine from being violently thrown backwards or overturned by its own power. For the sophisticated military hardware of the mid-20th century, it was a crude solution. But the engineers understood all too well the titanic forces they were about to unleash. In parallel, work was proceeding on a second prototype. This machine was intended to have a more traditional appearance. A vast, fully enclosed turret was mounted on the Centurion chassis, housing the entire 4-man crew. Yet, the armor on this colossal structure was a mere 14 millimeters thick around its entire perimeter. It offered protection from little more than shell splinters or pistol-caliber rounds. Proper armor was simply out of the question. Any significant increase in the turret's weight would have pushed the vehicle far beyond the acceptable 50-ton limit. On this second prototype, the complex revolver loading mechanism was abandoned entirely. It was a weapon system so utterly dominated by its own main armament that it ceased to be a practical vehicle of war. It became something else, a monument to a singular, brutal idea, a steel testament to the outer limits of conventional firepower, and a chilling reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that is simply too powerful to wield. The cramped, unforgiving confines of the turret simply could not accommodate such a cumbersome loading mechanism. The dream of automation had to be abandoned. In its place, the colossal ordnance would be served by 2 human loaders, their task a frantic, desperate ballet of muscle and steel. The machine's rate of fire was estimated at a mere 2 rounds per minute, a figure that was catastrophically slow by the brutal standards of modern tank warfare. To manage the cannon's immense power, the weapon was fitted with a hydropneumatic recuperator and an independent return-to-battery mechanism, a design significantly different from the first prototype. Yet another, more vexing problem soon emerged. the sighting equipment for the FV-4005. British industry, tasked with developing a specialized scope for this uniquely powerful weapon, was falling behind. Deadlines were missed, again and again. Finally, the engineers made a decision that surprised many. They reached not for a new piece of British technology, but for a relic of a vanquished enemy. The FV-4005 was fitted with a German TZ-F-12A gun sight, stripped from a captured Panther tank. It was high-quality optics, to be sure, proven in the crucible of the Second World War. And though the choice seemed bizarre for a top-secret British project, it allowed the trials to proceed without further delay. By June of 1953, the first prototype of the FV-4005 was rolled onto the proving grounds for its inaugural firing tests. Military officials and engineers held their breath. No one could truly predict how this steel beast would behave when the most powerful tank gun in history was unleashed for the very first time. The first shot left an indelible impression on the observers, and it was far from a joyous one. As the gunner depressed the trigger, the firing range convulsed with a deafening roar. The 50-ton machine lurched as if struck by a giant's hammer. The officers and engineers, watching from a safe distance, saw the tank's nose leap 22 centimeters into the air, while its stern simultaneously dropped by 12. When the gun was elevated to just 3 degrees, the rocking became even more violent, reaching 27 centimeters at the front and 19 at the rear. The machine was literally bucking, rearing up against the fury of its own cannon. The testers meticulously recorded every parameter, every shudder and jolt. The results were entered into official reports that would later stand as a testament to this audacious, perhaps insane experiment. When firing without the rear ground anchor, the entire vehicle was thrown backwards by 23 centimeters, creating a severe problem for re-aiming. With the anchor dug into the earth, the recoil was halved, but it remained far beyond what was considered acceptable for a combat vehicle. But the true nightmare began when the turret was traversed 90 degrees for a broadside shot. The official report, in its dry, bureaucratic language, noted that firing at this angle transmits oscillations of an extremely high amplitude with a rapid cycle to the hull. Translated into human terms, it meant the 52 entimeters, sending a destructive shockwave through every single component, every weld, and every bolt. It was a brutal, visceral lesson in the unforgiving laws of physics, a demonstration that even 50 tons of British steel could be tossed aside by a force of its own making. The project was a search for ultimate power, but in finding it, its creators had built a monster that threatened to tear itself apart with every pull of the trigger. The weapon was being subjected to forces for which it was, quite simply, never designed. During one phase of the trials, it became painfully obvious that the FV-4005's vertical traverse mechanism had completely and catastrophically failed. Upon inspection, the truth was as violent as it was undeniable. The concussive shock wave from the cannon's discharge had literally bent the internal components of the mechanism, warping hardened steel as if it were soft clay. The heavy mounting bolts, designed to secure the immense ordnance, had been sheared clean through, as if cut by a colossal knife. The very gun that was meant to annihilate Soviet tanks was, with every thunderous shot, systematically destroying its own vehicle from the inside out. Engineers began a frantic search for a way to reinforce the structure. But the problem was fundamental, a deep and intractable flaw in its very conception. The Centurion chassis, a proven and reliable platform, was simply not meant to endure such titanic punishment. It was a mortal's frame trying to contain the heart of an angry god. After a series of harrowing incidents, the Testing Commission issued a recommendation that sent a chill down the spines of the military leadership. The official document strongly advised against allowing any crew members to be physically present inside the FV-4005's turret during live-fire exercises, at least until a full cycle of instrumental testing could be completed. In other words, the machine had become so profoundly dangerous to its own operators that men were forbidden from being inside it while it performed its primary function. It was a weapon that could only be fired by an empty vessel. By July of 1955, a second prototype arrived, this one fitted with a fully enclosed turret, and it was immediately thrown into the brutal testing program. This machine would pass through a true purgatory. Over the course of its trials, its cannon was fired 133 times. Each shot a seismic event that shook the vehicle to its core and invariably revealed a new, unforeseen weakness. The turret's thin 14mm armor plate would groan and vibrate violently with every discharge. The testers inside compared the sensation to being trapped within a gigantic iron bell, being struck repeatedly by a sledgehammer. For the next year, trials on both prototypes continued, the primary goal now being to accumulate experience for the main event, the colossal FV-215 project, to be built upon the Conqueror heavy tank chassis. Every shot fired from the FV-4005 provided new and largely discouraging data on the behavior of a super heavy gun mounted on a tank. Accuracy at its maximum range of 2 kilometers left much to be desired, especially in a crosswind. The enormous, slow-moving projectile had such a large surface area that the wind would push it off its trajectory far more than the compact, high-velocity shells of conventional tank cannons. British engineers worked stubbornly to eliminate the identified shortcomings, believing that sooner or later they could tame this monster they had created. But while they battled the unyielding laws of physics, the world around them was changing with breathtaking speed. Technological progress was preparing to strike the FV-4005 a fatal blow from a direction no one had anticipated. On the horizon, a new kind of weapon was emerging, one that threatened to render the entire concept of the giant tank gun hopelessly obsolete. While Britain's finest minds wrestled with their 183mm behemoth, the laboratories of the West were giving birth to a weapon of an entirely different and far more insidious nature. It was the dawn of precision, an age that had little room for such magnificent, flawed, and brutal expressions of power. The entire doctrine of armored warfare. They were small, almost insignificant things. Finned projectiles with compact rocket motors, trailing a thin, spider's thread of wire. But these anti-tank guided missiles held a power that defied their size. For the first time, an operator could steer his shot in flight, correcting its path by radio or wire command, guiding it with unerring precision towards its target. They promised a guaranteed kill on a tank, at distances that were, until that moment, the exclusive domain of artillery and air power, far beyond the effective reach of any direct fire cannon. The cost of a single one of these missiles was a trivial fraction of the immense expense sunk into the development and prod gun. And therein lay the terrifying new logic of the battlefield. This missile could be mounted on almost any platform imaginable. A light ferret armored car, a helicopter, a common jeep, or even a simple tripod for infantry use. A lone soldier with a launcher on his shoulder could now stalk and destroy a multi-ton heavy tank from several kilometers away. And against this threat, there was no defense. The thickest steel plate ever rolled was suddenly, terrifyingly, vulnerable. For the British War Office, this presented an agonizing dilemma. Years of dedicated work and a fortune in public funds had been poured into the creation of the FV-445 and its even more ambitious sibling, the FV-215. These were to be the ultimate expressions of British heavy armor. Now, the Ent a surgeon's scalpel. At its maximum range of 2 kilometers, it struggled with accuracy. A crosswind could nudge the massive, slow-moving shell off its trajectory, turning a killing blow into a near miss. The guided missile, by contrast, flew precisely where its operator willed it. Missing the target became far more difficult than hitting it. The year 1957 became the watershed. The government announced a sweeping, radical reduction in military spending. In the cold corridors of Whitehall, the axe began to fall. Dozens of weapons development programs were put under review. Army regiments were amalgamated or disbanded entirely. Orders for new equipment were slashed, and one by one, promising projects were shuttered. In this new climate of brutal austerity, the FV-445 and FV-215 stood no chance. The verdict was delivered with swift, unappealable finality. Both projects were to be terminated, with all work ceasing immediately. The bureaucrats had done the arithmetic. The new anti-tank missiles, they calculated, provided the same combat effectiveness for an order of magnitude less cost. It was a cold, hard logic against which there was no argument. Why spend millions on a breathtakingly complex machine whose own gun blast could tear it apart, when a simple missile could solve the very same problem, cheaply and reliably? Adding to the decision was fresh intelligence suggesting the Soviet Union itself was gradually shifting away from the concept of super-heavy tanks, favoring instead the mass production of medium machines. The very threat the FV-445 was conceived to destroy was beginning to evaporate on its own. The prototypes met the sad fate of most experimental machines. They were unceremoniously dismantled, their enormous turrets lifted from their chassis, the components sent for storage or scrap. One of the turrets from the second prototype was given to the Royal Military College of Science at Shrivenham, intended for use as a training aid. It was to serve as a monument, a tangible lesson in engineering. A lesson, perhaps, in how even the most powerful giants of steel can be felled, not by a larger giant, but by a clever, simple, and revolutionary idea. It seemed the story of the world's largest tank gun had reached its inglorious end. The FV-4005 was destined for the footnotes of history, another evolutionary dead end in the frantic arms race of the Cold War. However, fate had other plans. Its colossal turret survived decades of quiet neglect. In 1971, it entered the collection of the Bovington Tank Museum, but it was no prized exhibit. Left in the open air, it became a rusting monument, battered by wind and rain. For years, children visiting the museum would clamber over its steel hide, their games echoing across a machine built for destruction. Long before such things were deemed a safety concern. By 2007, it was given a measure of dignity. The turret was mounted upon a Centurion chassis and placed at the museum's entrance, a strange and silent guardian. And then, the unexpected occurred. A computer game about armored warfare resurrected the FV-4005, not in steel, but in code. Millions of players across the globe learned of the British machine with the absurdly enormous gun, and it achieved a cult status its designers could never have imagined. This digital fame sparked a tangible fire. In 2024, an enthusiast named Ja Hughes, with the full support of the museum and the global gaming community, undertook the ultimate restoration. The turret was finally mated to an authentic Centurion Mark III chassis. A restored engine and transmission were carefully lowered into the hull. For the first time in nearly 70 years, the steel behemoth stirred and moved under its own power. A weapon designed for a war that never came, a failure by every practical metric of its day, was granted a second life. It proves that even our most audacious follies can be redeemed, their stories rewritten not by conflict, but by a shared passion that time itself cannot erase.